Hello, welcome back. I'm not sure how many of you are new, but if you're not, you can probably see the setup is different. I did all this pretty recently, so stuff might fall down, like nothing sticks to the wall, but look at this. We'll do this if it gets dark while I'm filming. The other just small thing is that I really appreciate all the support on my Appleways video. It's the first video I posted to get more than 100 views, and I'm really happy about that because it was something where there were a lot of points where I wasn't sure if I was going to finish it. Even if just one person watched it, I would be super happy, but there's like more than, I think, 200 now, so that makes me even happier. So now I think we can probably get into the main subject of today's video, which will be talking a little bit about historical accuracy and where our idea of historical accuracy in media comes from, what it looks like, why it's so important to us, and a little survey that I sent out, and I received so many great responses, and I'm really excited to talk about all of those, so let's get into it. Does this statement sound familiar to you? Something like, historical accuracy is really important, but it shouldn't get in the way of creativity, or it shouldn't get in the way of entertainment, something like that. I've seen this conversation pop up a lot recently on the internet, mainly as a debate surrounding the responsibility of historical media to educate us on what people of the past were really like, versus its responsibility to articulate a compelling artistic vision. Because I mostly study Western antiquity, that's a lot of the media that I have firsthand experience of, specifically Imperial Rome. So a lot of the sources and the films that I talk about in this video will address that specific context. We'll definitely discuss the representation of other cultures and time periods throughout. I've done my best to treat those by their own standards, but there's no way to do a truly comprehensive survey of historical accuracy that accounts for all the differences within the historical record and within modern media, so my attempt is not going to be perfect. This video was inspired by a great article from 2010 by Robert Stowe. It was called Popcorn and Circuses, in the book The Return of the Epic Film. This article will also be linked in the sources, along with all of the credits and my own survey. So discusses the relevance of historical accuracy in film to a general audience through a focus group of 78 viewers of Ridley Scott's 2000 film Gladiator and Neil Marshall's 2010 film Centurion, and by comparison to online forums and message boards. I was immediately drawn to this kind of methodology, especially since I haven't seen many articles or studies that discuss what we would kind of call like the online classics community in relation to either pop culture or academic issues, even now that so much discourse happens online. I found the audience's responses and Stowe's discussion very intriguing. It definitely changed my point of view, but he is very strongly advocating for a more historically accurate approach. I consider myself to be still a bit more liberal in my point of view, so I wanted to give a little bit more space to that position when I talk about this issue myself. Most decent scientific or statistical surveys are easily replicable in order to promote further discourse and as a show of integrity. So I conducted my own survey amongst 58 of my online peers in order to see how their ideas compare or contrast to Stowe's data. I didn't have access to the exact set of questions that Stowe had asked, and so I wrote my own based on what I read in his survey and what I was just most curious to learn more about. So I'll be supporting my points with quantitative data throughout the video. And in part 2, which was still part of this video when I filmed this intro, we'll go through all the qualitative responses so that I can give all of you your airtime and all the space and discussion that you deserve. But I also thought we should start with a little personal context where I want to discuss my mindset and how I'm going to approach this topic, and then some historical background on how our ideas of historical accuracy were constructed over time. So I'd like to think that I hold a bit of both the historian and the artist perspective. I don't have a degree yet, but I study classics in the sense of like ancient Greek and Roman history and literature, and I also study Chinese language and history. I can finally say that because I've only been doing the modern language for like literally a decade, and I just got back from a course in classical Chinese, so I finally have the tiniest bit of credibility in that subject. But as part of my own artistic practice, and a huge part of my interest in those time periods is not just in the history itself, but also in its reception. I like being able to respond to ideas I encounter in my research or in my classes by interpreting historical evidence through my aesthetic and creative preferences. And I'm also really influenced by online trends and pop cultures from around the world. But just like I wouldn't add anything historical that isn't researched, I wouldn't add anything ahistorical that isn't thoughtful or intentional. I have been reflecting that even though I've had like my own historical characters for a very long time, it was only a few years ago I really started drawing them in something kind of approaching like the historical context. And I think finding a way to synthesize my taste in modern media and fashion and aesthetics with my historical interests, I think that was what it really took for me to engage more deeply with the actual history. I think I used to have just a really limited idea of what historical accuracy looked like, and I felt like if I chose to draw people from history, I wouldn't be able to use the colors and textures and patterns that I liked. My knowledge of the time has also expanded a lot, and I've been able to do even more research and gather more diverse influences to inform my art. As I keep feeding my mind more on classical literature and artwork, I find myself seeking inspiration more and more from that history. And if you don't know, in addition to my visual art, I also am writing a screenplay. It's very based in my experience reading classical text and what I want to explore artistically. And because of that, I've never run into huge issues with accuracy, but I still feel like a really important part of my approach is that no idea of history that we have is truly accurate. We're learning more about the past every day, and even though we have more access to historical and particularly archaeological information, we still only have a small part of the whole story. So any critique of historical accuracy is only based on what survives, and as you likely know, what survives is often heavily biased and also very damaged, so it's not necessarily super reliable anyway. Every film, book, series, or any medium that's based on a historical time period must be fictional to some degree. So the question to me then becomes this: if the history itself is corrupted, why and to what extent should we attempt to recreate it? Those of you who responded to my survey were of many opinions on whether historical media should portray the past faithfully, and agreed more broadly on the fact that historical media doesn't pay enough attention to accuracy. So when we discuss these results, I'd like to first give a little information about my methodology. I composed a Google form of 21 statements, which participants rated on a scale from 1 to 5, with 1 being strongly disagree, 5 being strongly agree, and I also included 5 optional free response questions. Each question was optional, and not every participant answered every question. The form received 58 respondents, and it's linked in the notes if you want to see what they saw when they were filling it out, and if you want to look through the responses individually. I was really happy to see the form go beyond my immediate audience, but nevertheless, I did see the responses being a bit concentrated among people who have a very strong and, in some cases, a specialist knowledge of a specific time period with which they like to engage through media. The form was anonymous. There was the option for people to give their names or usernames if they would like to be credited for the qualitative response questions. So I will credit those responses to their owners. For the first question, the mean response was somewhere between neutral and agree, with the standard deviation being 0.93, so pretty high, but also kind of typical amongst all the questions in the survey. People agreed much more with the statement, "There isn't enough attention to historicity in media." Sorry about that noise, I kept hitting my laptop. With a mean of 4.31 and a standard deviation of 0.78. And a lot of you also agreed on the ability of historical media to generate interest in a particular time period. The mean for this question was 4.40, and the standard deviation was also 0.78. So with that, I'd like to do a little exploration of what historical accuracy has looked like in Western art history, and why we value or don't value it so much today. We often date the end of antiquity to the 5th century CE, after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. However, Roman influence lingered in the ruins of the new landscapes, which sustained a strong cultural interest in their past among medieval writers and artists. The Byzantines of the Eastern Roman Empire also continued to develop the legacy of the Greeks and Romans. They called themselves Romaioi, which means the Romans, and they modeled themselves on classical precedents. So it was not difficult to come across classical subjects in medieval art. But you'll notice looking at something like this miniature of the Bona Dea scandal, or this one an illustration for a commentary of De Bello Gallico, there's nothing identifiably Roman about the content of these images. The reason for this is both practical and ideological. First of all, there was not widespread excavation, study, and discussion of actual material evidence on which artists could base their representations of the time period. A few objects such as coins and cameos likely provided some guidance, but those were usually kept in private collections. A second reason likely lies in the political relevance of antiquity. Dressing Alexander the Great or Julius Caesar in contemporary attire offers a sense of continuity between those leaders' power and legitimacy and that of the current regime. In the Renaissance, many artists took a greater interest in accurately recreating aspects of historical dress and scenery, but as we can see, those representations still differ significantly from what we would consider historically accurate today. I found a really interesting example in this column called Art Notes, the Journal of Catholic Art and Culture Prologos. This one is titled The Glorious and Untidy Mix of Art, Culture, and Faith, and it was written by the managing editor, Catherine Ware, who is an art history professor at the University of Chicago. And of course, the specific article discusses historicity in Catholic art, so I think it's very relevant to the subject of the reception of antiquity. Most of that artwork deals with subjects from antiquity, and because of the prestige associated with religious art in Western culture, and often influence artistic trends and movements in other genres. Many of us today are familiar with images of the Holy Family from the Renaissance onwards, which have been increasingly criticized for representing the historical Jesus, Mary, and others as white Europeans, which is something that Ware acknowledges when she views these works with her students. However, she points out that artists from different time periods and different cultures have chosen to represent religious figures from their own point of view. For example, the Chinese artist Wu Hongnian painted the Virgin Mary in Chinese dress. Within the faith, these various images can coexist, because these religious figures often hold extremely localized and culturally specific significance, so that's where one point of view comes from. Generally, these images figures and events from scripture as religious subjects. But whether you believe in his teachings and miracles or not, we do know for fairly certain that Jesus was a real historical figure. So inevitably, just like modern film and pop culture, Catholic art also has its fanatic historical devotees, and they might be older than you may have been expecting. In the 1800s, a group of German Romanticist painters moved to Rome and became known as the Nazarenes. They believed all art since the 16th century was totally corrupt. They studied only from Renaissance masters, in addition to becoming almost hermetically religious, wearing biblical robes, and growing long beards. And even in their day, art critics, clerics, and clients all hated the Nazarenes. Society called them Gedankenkunst.
I don't speak German, but it's flipping.
Ware translates this as ideated art, which has no real substance, and viewers complained that their works were lifeless and charmless, having sacrificed all sense of vitality for accuracy. The Nazarenes themselves provided another example of the kind of historical fallacy that I think a lot of people in this discussion fall into, of kind of the historical truth. As in, they base most of their work not on research of Roman-era Palestinian and Jewish history and culture, but on the European Renaissance tradition, with the result that they perpetuated historical and cultural inaccuracies. I feel like a lot of the issues that we can see in the Nazarene movement also affect historical media today. They were highly selective about what aspects of history they represent. They didn't recognize the bias and unreliability of their sources, and they used their false sense of authority to dismiss progress and development in art in favor of recreating the same stale techniques and ideas. Meanwhile, the excavation of Pompeii had been underway since the late 18th century and caused a second revival of classical influence on European culture and politics. Unlike the Renaissance, this time artists, the neoclassicists who so wished, could actually go to archaeological sites and witness details from ancient life that were unknown to earlier generations. For example, in this era, we see a much wider acknowledgement of polychromy in the ancient world, whereas in the Renaissance and earlier, they usually use very muted neutral tones and whites because all the surviving statues and architecture had lost their pigment over time. The general public also became very invested in this rediscovery. We see trends like column dresses or jasperware. This is mine. This also facilitated the success of books like The Last Days of Pompeii, Ben-Hur, and Quo Vadis, which meticulously wove together epic stories with minute historical detail, fastidiously locating each character within specific sites, carefully describing every fresco and statue, also often based on archaeological finds, and frequently referencing real events from classical sources or using real historical figures to fill out the cast. However, authors had to balance appealing to the Rome-loving reading public through luscious descriptions of visual and sensual opulence, with appealing to their contemporary Christianized sensibility that rejected the excess of the empire. Adaptations of these books were among some of the first commercial films to be made and initiated the beginnings of the peplum genre. I think this era of literature set the tone for a lot of historical media. Even though something may deal heavily in modern perspectives, audiences will expect it to include enough specificity and identifiably Roman or classical details to maintain its credibility. Also, at the turn of the 20th century, photography and video became more widespread art forms. Artists responded to this development with movements like Impressionism, which elevated the impression or the idea of a subject more than its physical likeness through looser, more stylized brushwork and brighter-than-life colors, which were also made possible by scientific and technological advancements. This Impressionist movement represented the personal and intellectual freedom of the era, at least for wealthy European men, and the changing role of art in a new technology-driven society. I think this moment is what drove a lot of the emphasis that we now place on artistic freedom, because now we have things like archaeological and photographic documentation. So I think many people see realism and accuracy as redundant. These days, we have more access to history than ever before. However, I think the sense of familiarity is deceptive. Many of the things that we learn about ancient Rome are inaccurate and based on unreliable sources or exaggerations. For example, people like the drama of two gladiators fighting to the death. They like the vomitoria. They like thinking of people like Nero and Caligula as completely insane, despotic rulers. In the last few decades, history as an academic field has increasingly moved away from a positivist view as the pursuit of a single, objective, and comprehensible truth, and towards interpretation in context and accounting for a wider range of possibilities and subjective experiences. For more on this development, I looked at this paper, History, Historicism, and the Social Logic of the Text in the Middle Ages by Gabrielle M. Spiegel, and this article is a little bit old. It's from 1990, but I found it informative. I hope you will. Spiegel seems to take the social logic of the text as, I'm quoting from her, its location within a broader network of social and intertextual relations. And she writes that a literary history that begins with a focus on the social logic of the text will tend to look at local or regional social structures and processes rather than at society as a global whole. It preserves the emphasis of cultural history in seeking textuality as both arising from and constitutive of social life, which it seeks to endow with meaning. It acknowledges that reality, context, social structure, and the like appear to present historians only through past texts that are interpretively reconstituted, and that history as the object of our knowledge is inevitably absent and knowable only through textually mediated representations. She also writes, literary text and historical context are not the same thing, and if one should not be reduced to the other, neither should they be held up as identical foci of the scholar's gaze. History, as given chronicle or unproblematic truth, simply does not exist, and so cannot serve as a master narrative for criticism into which the enigmatic codes of literary discourse can be transcoded and clear. Moreover, since the historical text is not given but must be constructed, the historian of text is a writer in his or her function of constituting the historical narrative, but a reader of the already materially extant text. So what I got from this is that text as an object can and often must be interpreted within its social logic, the historical and linguistic background from which it came. And this is a relatively new development to look at a source in its own time and place, rather than, as Spiegel says, as part of a broader universal conception of society or human history. Spiegel also notes the phenomenon of recognizing history as unknowable except through text. Therefore, the historian who aims to study a period of time through text must simultaneously reconstruct and deconstruct the history, as both a writer making meaning from the text and a reader who dissects it in order to make meaning. I did feel like this article helped fill me in a bit on the development of the specific approach to history that we see being more popular now. And I do think Spiegel kind of implicitly, at least her argument implicitly sanctions the less strict interpretation of history equals text equals reality. I hope that tells you a bit about how historical accuracy has figured into art, text, and reception over time.
You having this much time pass between Gladiator and Gladiator 2, like how do you kind of get yourself immersed back into the world?
I'm like a child. I look at pictures. I'm more like that. I look at pictures. I don't read. People say, you don't read history books? I say, no. I'd fall asleep. I look at pictures.
So now that people are increasingly permissive of artistic license, even at the expense of realism, and now that people no longer see history and text as connected to each other or to reality, how do we identify a work as belonging to a specific time period? In my discussion, I'll use Greek and Roman antiquity when it diverges from the historical record. In the modern era, we often rely on things that I will refer to as signifiers. Signifiers are not quite stereotypes, but they're more like tropes that are coded in pop culture as belonging to antiquity. This can be things like laurel wreaths, the Colosseum, gladiators, draped clothing, saying Ave, etc., etc. And while they do often have a distant historical basis, they are often applied more liberally than necessary. For example, when an audience watches a scene that takes place in an arena, they'll probably expect the gladiators to say, "We who are about to die salute you." And that did happen. Suetonius and Cassius Dio tell us a group of gladiators addressed the Emperor Claudius this way. But that was only one event, and the phrase is not attested as part of the typical proceedings. Nevertheless, it fits so well with the spectacle and ceremony of Roman games that authors, artists, and filmmakers continue to reference it until it seemed like a genuine historical detail with real precedence. Stowe additionally highlights believability as the core value that the audience treasures over accuracy. Believability is a delicate balance between historical accuracy, historical signifiers, and modern assumptions. If Robert Taylor, in the opening of Quo Vadis, rode into the Eternal City on something like a speeder from Star Wars,
oh, hell no, man, what the fuck?
The audience would not buy that at all. It would be visibly and obviously ahistorical, and it would ruin not just the credibility of that scene, but the entire rest of the film. But you might be surprised to learn that having him ride in on a chariot is not actually really that more accurate, I guess. The Roman army didn't use chariots during the Neronian era. However, because chariots are so strongly associated with ancient Rome, they've become that kind of signifier to the audience. It doesn't break the illusion of historicity that the film relies upon. The conclusion that Stowe raises from this is that even if historical accuracy, from a historian's point of view, is kind of egregious, it doesn't strongly influence a popular audience's enjoyment of the film. Stowe also very astutely reminds us that the historians who recount real events, upon which many epics are based, apply their own interpretations, even a bit of artistic license. A lot of Roman historians were writing decades or even centuries after the events they described, and it was massively common for authors to change important details in order to discredit opposing political movements and figures and to flatter others. The practice of historiography was totally different, and there was no widespread practice of quoting and citing sources. It's interesting to consider what this means, as we've seen a resurgence of the historical epic in the last 2 decades, almost all of which have crashed and burned critically and often commercially. And I think historical accuracy plays a not insignificant role in how much people hate new epics like Gladiator, 300, Troy, especially because now we also widely recognize that their aesthetics and their plot are completely based on nothing, and our brains and eyeballs have been tortured for nothing. Let's look at Stowe's focus group and how they describe their preferences. So participant A says, I would much rather the film I see be entertaining as opposed to being historically accurate. It would be good for film to be historically accurate, but an entertaining plot for me is much more important than anything else. So if that means a film is historically questionable, so be it. Participant B says, cinema is for entertainment and making money. Documentary film is for education, mainly funded by cinema profits. Participant C says, film's responsibility to educate is a difficult question. Most films like this are only based loosely on historical facts, referring to Gladiator and Centurion. I believe they should try to stick as close to them as possible, but I go see a film for entertainment. And in that respect, I would rate it as being more important to entertain than to educate. If it does both, then great, but the entertainment is more important. And participant D says, for me, asking if historical film has a need to be accurate is like arguing over whether art has to mimic real life. I believe we have many interesting abstract pieces of work, so the answer for me is a resounding no. Classicist and media expert Martin Winkler, as quoted by Stowe, seems to suggest that historical accuracy may not even be a good investment for the studios. Who among audiences of Mervyn LeRoy's Quo Vadis paid attention to or remembered afterwards that most of the decor of these films was highly authentic and had been recreated lovingly and at great expense? Were not the climactic arena sequences much more fascinating through their visceral appeal? Winkler's argument here implies that even if a film does everything right, audiences probably won't care. I do think the attention to detail and the element of historical recreation seem to be actually a pretty major aspect of the appeal and even the marketing of Quo Vadis. It certainly did that for the book, and I think people tend to remember it more fondly now because of that. However, it also perpetuated a lot of stereotypes and false misconceptions, like that Nero played the liar while Rome burned, and it made up a lot of its own history, even accelerating the entire collapse of his reign. But I won't get too hung up on what is just an illustration of Winkler's larger point. So let's ask you guys. This was the first statement that I put before you, which is historical accuracy doesn't even exist. And you disagreed with the statement for the most part. The mean response was 2.31, and the standard deviation was about 1, so proportionally very few people whom I surveyed agreed. And then when I posed another statement closely modeled on Winkler's comments, nobody strongly agreed. Only 3.4% agreed at all with the statement that attempting to accurately recreate history on screen is a waste of resources. The mean was about 1.47, and the standard deviation was only about 0.71. But I think Mervyn Winkler is a great scholar, and he has a lot of really interesting writing. So I do recommend you look into him if you are into classical reception at all. But even so, I wasn't expecting so many historical accuracy fans here, because I know a lot of us also really enjoy historically inaccurate stuff. So this was a bit of a surprise for me. And it especially seemed like a very strong contrast with Stowe's focus group, and that's where I feel like maybe some of the bias that comes from my online audience may play into it. Stowe goes on to discuss what he calls the essence of history. One participant said, whilst Gladiator may not be 100% historically accurate, I feel that it still captured the essence of history. As long as movies like Gladiator are entertaining and have the essence of history down, I'm good. And so compared this to Thucydides. Thucydides is one of the authors where we can kind of attribute the beginning of the historiographic tradition to him. where he did start putting more emphasis on retelling events without bias. So puts it as adhering to the spirit of the time or circumstance being described. That's what Thucydides did. Another participant said, Gladiator contained everything I'd expected in a movie about the Romans. Warfare, slaves, gladiators, chariots, villainous emperors, backstabbing senators, and a whole lot of political squabbling. And so, response to this saying, this evokes the problematic nature of the essence of history, that it depends on a prior conception of what it should be. I completely agree with that. I think it's very clear that historical accuracy becomes a bit of a cycle, where even if something is presented that's a complete historical misconception, if it becomes repeated by enough media properties, and if those properties make enough money and they reach enough people, they will eventually just become accepted as fact. And in today's era of kind of widespread anti-intellectualism and populism in media, I think it's also important to discuss this idea of pretentiousness, which I think a lot of people conceive of classics as a pretentious field. And there are some people I've met where I can't really argue with that, but for the most part, just like any other field, expert opinions in that field should be valued when it comes to engaging with that subject. It's not pedantic or pretentious to somebody who's been studying this for their entire career. But coming off as pretentious can be a really major hazard when you're marketing a historical film. Stowe explored this when he asked the focus group about one of the main characters in Gladiator. His name is Proximo, and Stowe points out that Proximo is in the O sound, so that identifies it as a dative or ablative. Those cases are not used for names in Latin, but when he brought this up with the focus group, they all saw it as too pedantic. And this is the kind of thing where it's yes, that's a very small scale detail, but because it's so small, that means it's so easy to fix, and it would have been so easy to just completely avoid the whole conversation. After all, it's the name of the character, so you would think it should give us a better idea of the time. I think this trend where people just don't really want to observe what they're watching and don't want to think critically and identify these small inaccuracies has really dulled the role of media and degraded it from a work of art that can broaden our minds and our tastes to a product that can be consumed. So based on this interaction, I wanted to get your ideas again, and the statement I wrote for this was, criticizing media from the perspective of historical accuracy is pedantic. And this statement was not popular. The mean was 2.2. And the standard deviation was about 1.06. So there was a range, but overall most people disagreed with the statement. And I'm with you guys. I think whether you choose to follow history or not, your job as an artist is also to be open to criticism, and that can come from any perspective, and you don't have to take it all, but I think if you're willing to disregard history, you should be open to the fact that people are going to criticize you for it. Just whenever you put out a work of art, it's not up to you what people notice about it, what people like and what people dislike. If you can decide, okay, this thing doesn't impact my personal enjoyment of a story, and that's great, but everyone has a different experience, even when they're watching and viewing the same thing. So based on this, I was also curious to ask you guys where the line between the creator and the audience should lie in terms of distinguishing accurate representations. One of these statements was, historical media should include a disclaimer stating if and where it's not entirely accurate. And I was very surprised by this response because of how positive it was. The mean was 3.7. The standard deviation was 1.23, which is pretty high. So it was a little more divisive than some of my other statements, but I was just surprised because Stowe had asked his group about the possibility of including disclaimers, and they responded very negatively. And I find it interesting how I feel like you guys have kind of the inverse, where you do really value historicity, and yet you favor the idea of media saying in what areas it diverges from that. And at first I was kind of with them, because I feel like it is up to the viewer. I definitely see the value in this. I think, first of all, the conversation around media literacy is very different even now than it was in 2010, so this position would probably have been more unpopular anyway. And logically, it's common for historical media to say, like, based on true events. So why not be more explicit about where it's based on fiction? This also just occurred to me, but I think in terms of other media, like especially books, it's very common for there to be like an afterword or an author's note that talks about the historical sources behind it. So there's that too. But it's a big difference between thoughtful and artistic subversions of expectations versus inattention to history for profit. I'll not be talking about L'asinodoro processo per fratissimi con producios abolus cittadino romano because the budget for that movie was $75 and a fisheye lens, and they made history.
Be fun. It's going to be a very epic. I wanted to make my one thing was I went into the Disney Channel building and I sat down with the president of Disney Channel and I said, I want to make history. And that's what this is.
Ridley Scott's Gladiator and its sequel, which, believe it or not, was unreleased at the time I scripted and filmed this video, is probably one of the most divisive recent films to approach the subject of ancient Rome. The film is mostly reviled by academics, despite inarguably having revived the peplum genre in the early 2000s and 2010s. It achieved some commercial success. It actually wasn't as big of a hit as I had thought it was based on the pop culture impact. Gladiator and its loose approach to history provided a clear blueprint for the second wave peplum genre, so I think it's an important film to read more closely. However, I have not personally seen Gladiator, so all the intelligent points in this section can also be found in Elena Theodorakopoulos' book, Ancient Rome at the Cinema. I really can't recommend the book enough if you're interested in classical reception. So from this book, I learned that Ridley Scott, the film's director, actually has a background in advertising, and so the artistic direction of his films is often his principal concern. As a result, while he was working on Gladiator, Scott aimed to distance his work from, at that point, cliched and unfashionable earlier films and their imagery. During his press run, he emphasized how he wanted to bring a different look to antiquity. Scott achieved this through narrative and cinematic devices. For example, a preference for a close-up over wide shots, heavy, fast-paced editing, laconic dialogue, but also through costumes and set designs that, in their brutalism and palette of black, gray, gold, and red, evoked the totalitarian Nazi or fascist Italian regimes, particularly during crowd or state scenes. For example, Scott replaced the historic purple border on senatorial togas with a black border. While these changes also serve the narrative, Scott has said that Gladiator is a film where the world came first, then the story. That story was constantly rebuilt throughout pre-production, and some critics felt that it lacked direction and intention. Basically, Scott made a movie that, thanks to its underbaked plot and dialogue and overly stylized and detailed execution, ended up being one long commercial. All of Scott's choices, whether you agree with them or not, were intended to complement the world building of Gladiator specifically. However, the film ended up setting a formula for successive projects that also sought to modernize the historical epic, with the result that I think people now feel a lot less kindly towards Gladiator than if it had just been a single outlier within the genre. And while Scott attempted to bend history to his artistic vision, many academics and historians weren't impressed by the results. According to Stowe, the historical consultant, Kathleen Coleman, had a very negative experience on set. She's quoted as saying, "The historical consultant should be a person who is intimately involved with the entire process of making the film." So paraphrases that a consultant should not simply point out everything that was wrong, but suggest how to correct it. It is thus unsurprising that, in ignoring the latter part of her role, Gladiator falls outside the academic boundaries of historical acceptability. Reflecting on her experiences, Coleman concluded, "If the standard for authenticity is determined by what has already been monumentalized on screen, the consultant really has no part to play at all. Maybe there is a residual notion in the film industry that the hiring of a consultant is itself enough to give a film a veneer of responsibility. If that attitude exists, it is, to say the least, unethical, and it is predicated upon the assumption, undoubtedly correct, that the vast majority of cinema goers have no way of judging the authenticity of a historical film, and do not care at all whether it is authentic or not." So what I get from Coleman's quote and Stowe's discussion is, first of all, they sound very pessimistic. This whole article had kind of that perspective, but I think that's an important part to see where these historians are coming from, where they're judging historical accuracy not necessarily in the context of just one single film or even in the film industry, but also looking at how it impacts society and the way that the general population receives history. But the main point was that often historical accuracy is reduced to just an aspect of film criticism. Filmmakers don't see it as part of their responsibility or their integrity as artists. And second, that historical accuracy is very strongly shaped by culture. Stowe references the academic boundaries of historical acceptability, which the Gladiator team violated by disregarding expert opinions. By ignoring what is standard procedure in the study of history, they undermine their own legitimacy to specialist viewers and probably a good part of the general audience. Third, as a consequence of this performative attitude towards historicity and a snowball of innocuous changes, all I'm sure in the name of creative freedom, a general audience has few, if any, credible expectations from historical media. What does it mean that you can go into a theater and have no idea if any of what you're about to see is true to life or not? Also, film is an art form, it's its own medium, and just like any other artistic medium, it has its own challenges and limitations that no amount of study and no amount of technological expertise can overcome. Neil Marshall, the director of Centurion, discovered this while testing weaponry for the Roman legion stationed in the far north of Britannia around the early 2nd century CE. He originally intended for his soldiers to carry the pilum, which is the standard issue for that time, but it didn't test well on camera, it was too thin and narrow, and so he was forced to swap in the later Lancia of the 3rd century. And that's something where a viewer might see it and think that it's an inaccuracy that should have been fixed, when in fact it was researched and it was experimented upon, but it was simply not possible to execute on camera. However, the modern film industry is also constantly developing new techniques to realize a director's vision no matter the expense. CGI innovations allow filmmakers to go beyond accuracy for an inflated sense of epic scale that ends up depersonalizing the experience. It enables all these shots and angles that create a more distant point of view. One critic writing about Gladiator writes that the Roman Colosseum is roughly the size of the Death Star from Star Wars thanks to the magic of computer graphics.
So look at the racetrack from the 2016 remake of Ben-Hur and how they film it and how sensationalizing it is and how inflated the scale is. And then compare it with the original version from 1959 where it's still very grand and epic, but it retains this focus on just the two characters and the emotional intensity between them.
A lot of this is also due to the success of Titanic, the James Cameron film, and his whole style, which is very heavily emphatic on spectacle over substance and has been broadly criticized for that. And of course, CGI played a big role in the development of sci-fi film, which at this point was dominated by the Star Wars prequels. So I don't think that overall it was a great leap forward for the historical epic genre in particular, while older epics achieved a similar effect with a lot more humanity and charm by using legions of UCLA students and matte paintings. But notably, those sets and paintings are also very ahistorical. A lot of them provide these kind of grand vistas of Rome that never existed. A lot of the architecture, it looks like those Renaissance fantasy landscape paintings. But that brings up what I see as a core issue between first and second wave peplum, being that the second wave films are more believable to modern sensibilities, therefore audiences are just less likely to question them. The very thing that made early historical epics so popular, those that in fact reflect history much more than its successors, the colorful elaborate costumes, the kitschy emotionality, the unmatched camp value, are all qualities that audiences now associate with a historicity. Another aspect of Centurion that some of Stowe's focus group singled out was its use of makeup on the female characters. As Stowe points out, women in the ancient world did wear makeup. There's ample historical evidence for this. But it's not believable to a lot of the participants because they have grown to believe that the ancient world had no color, that people placed no importance on self-expression.
But because it's my job, I should also point out how nobody questioned the way Etain, the Celtic warrior, had shaved armpits.
And I think that speaks to the kind of lack of individuality that this filmmaking style pushes onto people from the past. And we see this in second wave peplum in the hair and wardrobe. Actors are always wearing very minimal makeup, 2000s plucked eyebrows. Even in the 2010s, they were dark and muted colors, loose casual hairstyles.
Exhibit A, I see this everywhere. I think it's based on the Korai statues from archaic Greece, but obviously none of these films are set in archaic Greece, and they had radically different standards of modesty and presentation.
Chunky metal jewelry and hideous fashion atrocities as they would hardly pass for a dish towel in Roman times. I think a lot of this is due to the fact that the Hollywood ideology has kind of shifted from celebrating the cultural triumph of American capitalism
to processing the Great Recession as well as all of the post 9/11 changes in American culture.
I think because of this context, audiences turned on first wave peplum, which seemed too extravagant and too over the top, and accepted the second wave version as more accurate, from which they drew assumptions about antiquity on which to base all future judgment. But if we look at ancient Roman trends in fashion, hair, and makeup, we'll see many commonalities with those of the 50s and early 60s. So maybe this means that the relative accuracy of those films is mostly coincidental. But nevertheless, I think we can connect these choices to filmmakers' desire to avoid challenging the audience, even just aesthetically. I want to also show you guys this video that I found really interesting that discusses modern Chinese beauty standards.
It's by Dr. Candice Lin on Instagram, and I'll link both the video and her profile in the notes because this is a series, so you can definitely check out her profile and see more.
Modern beauty standards that got into costume drama. Part 2. In ancient China, the M-shaped hairline is one of the criteria for selecting beautiful women. It's known as the beauty peak, 美人尖 in Mandarin. Nowadays, actresses are obsessed with ultra-low hairlines because it's proof of hair volume. So hair powder has found its way into costume drama. Yu Jingyi used so much powder, netizens said she must have wiped her forehead with asphalt. Other actresses created a hairline that's so neat and round, it doesn't look like real human anymore. In the past, beauties with different types of noses can be seen on TV. But now, everyone is obsessed with European style, tall and straight nose bridge with a cute and pointy tip. Some underwent rhinoplasty and inserted a silicone prosthetic which often emits light. In Xu Jingyi's costume drama, even under faint candlelight, her nose bridge is translucent like jade. In Legend of Fei, Wang Yibo's nose is transmitting light from root to tip, igniting rumors of him getting plastic surgery.
The difference is very stark from what we see in classical China, like for example in the Tang Dynasty, for women to be considered beautiful, for example men to have a plump and round face, the beauty peak that she mentions, and that is something that's like almost a complete opposite in China today. I also think it's good to point out that this isn't just an issue that affects women on screen. There's also a wider trend of audiences criticizing the male lead. There's also an interesting case in the 2008 film by John Woo, Red Cliff, where he cast Takeshi Kaneshiro to play William, but Kaneshiro was a former idol. And in this film, he has very much like a boy band type of attractiveness that seemed like it was appealing to like more of the teenage girl audience that you wouldn't normally expect a male action director to try and appeal to through a historical film. And I really enjoyed his performance in this movie, even though Takeshi Kaneshiro is not idealized terracotta warrior come to life type of guy. And that's also something we see a lot in modern films set in ancient Greece and Rome, where people have criticized actors like Brad Pitt or Colin Farrell for not having the kind of gravitas of older actors like the Richard Burton and Robert Taylor and Charlton Heston, that generation. So we see both our present modern ideas of masculinity and of femininity affecting the way we perceive characters who come from the past. As Stowe has observed, historical believability becomes a self-sustaining toxic loop in which, as long as media keeps copying the same set of inaccuracies, it will go unchallenged by a mass audience. And only based on the imperfect and limited biased results of my survey, the impulse to appeal to an audience's desire to be entertained over their desire for historical accuracy and credibility may be misguided. One statement that I put to the participants was, I would rather watch a film that is entertaining than a film that is accurate. And I was thinking that when I put this to you guys as the kind of binary choice, that many people would probably go for accuracy and they would say, like, I agree with this statement. But what actually happened was most people were neutral on this, and there were actually more respondents who disagreed with it than respondents who agreed. The mean response was 2.89, and the standard deviation was 0.95. I gave you this statement: I get annoyed when historical media is inaccurate. Most of you agreed. Then I was really interested to see if historical accuracy was such a concern that you might ever disengage from something because of it. So the next one I asked was, I've stopped reading or watching a book or movie or series because of historical errors. And this one is like a little more idiosyncratic, and I guess it would also be based on like if you're the type of person who walks out of movies and things like that. So maybe predictably the responses were a little more spread out. The mean was 3.27, and the standard deviation was 1.34, which was definitely the largest of any question on the survey. So this did end up having the most varied responses. But this was also one that I was hoping if you answered affirmatively, then you would go into the qualitative response section and tell me a bit about it. So we'll get to discuss this more later. Then kind of the inverse, I asked, I'm more likely to watch something that I know will be historically accurate. And this was a very resounding yes. The mean response was 4.1, and the standard deviation was 0.99. And nobody strongly disagreed with this question. So now the question I have is, where's the creative freedom that these audiences and filmmakers are leaping to defend? If I knew that my audience would rather be entertained than educated,
Just to name one example,
I'd have everybody painted different colors, looking at tomb paintings and mosaics from 1,000 years apart and quoting Hadrian. But as I've been researching for this video, I've kind of felt like my initial attitudes were a bit idealistic. I know that I'm not like a paradigm of originality and artistic excellence, but I do think that modern corporate Hollywood cannot be trusted to leverage historical accuracy in favor of questioning popular assumptions and adding unique perspectives over soothing the single dominant ideology. Why is it all the same? One aspect of the modern world that I think has really ushered in this kind of era post-creativity is the global monoculture. These days, every Hollywood film has a multi-million-dollar marketing budget and distribution deals around the entire world, and it can also be released instantly on streaming to an international audience. And this means that often the Anglophone perspective dominates over other film industries, which perpetuates a narrow view of the ancient world. I don't think it's objectively bad for British or American, Australian, whatever filmmakers to work with classical subjects. And I think we should keep in mind that a lot of this derives from the British tradition of classical reception. The UK does have almost half a millennium of Roman rule that left a huge influence on the modern country and consequently on the English-speaking world. The other perhaps obvious disclaimer is that any work of art is going to be informed by the culture and context from which it originates. Nevertheless, this dominance of Hollywood productions elevates that view of antiquity in a way that isn't often faithful to the time period. Even within the English-speaking world, films might rely on culturally specific assumptions that privilege an Anglo-American audience's believability over others' historical accuracy and reality. So it's worth emphasizing that the particular signifiers and standards of believability we have didn't come out of nowhere, but are very strongly based in the relationship that exists between antiquity and the Anglo-American world. A very strong example of this can be found in films like Quo Vadis and Spartacus, which rely on American and British class stereotypes by generally casting Americans as the slave or Christian heroes, and Britons as the patrician Romans. A much less successful example would be Oliver Stone's Alexander, which maps Anglophone linguistic identities onto characters for whom it is completely unnecessary. The whole idea only reinforces Anglophone audiences' entitlement to have historical narratives contorted into a context that they can understand. rather than broadening their own minds to consider those subjects within their own time. I want to also note here the issues Alexander has with miscasting the Persian and Bactrian roles, like Roxana and Bagos, with a specifically white Anglophone perspective that any ethnically ambiguous look and accent will suffice to communicate what are actually very specific, well-researched, and established ancient cultures. Stowe also discusses how Rome's symbolism in Anglo-American culture is strongly connected with power, corruption, excess, and luxury. Stowe says that Rome therefore provides the ideal screen on which to project our concerns about contemporary international relations, domestic politics, and cultural and social tensions. One participant in Stowe's group said, "I guess it makes sense that there would be modern influences on the film. As long as they make it entertaining and enjoyable, it doesn't bother me. If anything, it would probably make me appreciate the film more. I would probably find it more accessible than if I was watching a 1,000-year-old political debate that was irrelevant to me." Another said, "Fine if they find some point in the past which is relevant and applicable so they don't have to make too many changes." And I think these participants also bring up a bit of what I was talking about earlier, like culture always influences art, and that can often be a very positive thing. They talk about the political meaning of the film, and I think that's a very good point, that showing how people from the past dealt with similar issues to those we have today can be a really great thing for audiences. But we'll talk a little bit about how that's often not really the case, and a lot of the time these filmmakers actually end up perpetuating just like very tired, very harmful stereotypes and ideas in the political messaging of their historical films. But Stowe goes on to discuss this other academics writing.
Monica Serino.
Serino argues that films about antiquity can play an important role in bridging the gap between past and present because they offer an interpretation of history, literature, and mythology that are fully relevant to a contemporary audience. Yet the contemporary version of history is not always so well received. Another respondent said, "Films are primarily for entertainment. I do not believe they have any responsibility to teach. However, I do think that it is entirely inappropriate to knowingly mislead the audience, particularly on important and sensitive subjects. I particularly hate the Americanization of history by Hollywood. This only furthers America's arrogance and ignorance, and almost every other country in the world instantly hates the film because of it." This decision to localize history into a specifically American context in mainstream film rarely works out for the better and often just leads to very unfortunate decisions. The unfortunate decision we are talking about now is 300, which is probably pretty widely accepted to be just the worst peplum film that's ever been made. Basically, it follows King Leonidas and his 300 Spartans as they fight against the massive Persian army led by King Xerxes. While it's based on real events, 300 overly glorifies the Spartans as masculine heroes fighting to defend the Western heartland against the corrupt and effeminate Eastern invaders. Reviewers and scholars quickly picked up on the distasteful similarities between 300's portrayal of its Persians and the representation of Middle Eastern, Persian, and Arab people on the news at a time when the USA was involved in the Iraq War and the War on Terror. 300 uses a historical costuming to highlight the Spartan heroism by clothing them in loincloths, cloaks, and greaves that show off their strength and their mental discipline. And to my mind, kind of equate them with the American comic book or sci-fi hero. They also highlight the Persian perceived decadence and material and sensual indulgence through lavish jewelry and heavy makeup. Mark Yankovic writes in his chapter, "For many critics of the film, the story of macho white guy versus effeminate Orientals was clearly a metaphor for the war in Iraq. Indeed, numerous critics noted that Persian archvillain Xerxes is an 8-foot-tall god king who looks like RuPaul beyond the Thunderdome, or a queenly strut fest pitched somewhere between RuPaul and Ming the Merciless." Another critic, Roger Ebert, comments, "I am just about prepared to believe that the ancient Persians went in for the piercing of ears, cheeks, eyebrows, noses, lips, and chins. But Xerxes' eyebrows have been plucked and redrawn into black arches that would make Joan Crawford envious." I think the historical epic in the last few decades has especially become a medium to specifically celebrate American hypermasculinity and militarism. In particular, Mark Yankovic notes how while the original Spartacus celebrates the rebels' collective effort, Gladiator, which borrows heavily from Kubrick's 1960 original, celebrates individual revenge for the personal injustice Maximus suffered at Commodus's hands. From the British perspective, Bruno Heller, writer of HBO's 2005 Rome miniseries, told the Times Online, "One of the joys of the Roman value system for us now is that it is modern man unmasked. Everything we secretly wish for, to humiliate our enemies, to be adored by the masses, to have sex with whomever we want, to take what we like. All the sadomasochistic elements of human nature were right out in the open in the Roman world. Cruelty was a virtue. Mercy was a flaw." A few of you guys also commented on this issue in the survey, and 89.5% of the 57 who responded to the statement agreed to some extent that historical media was too Americanized, with the remaining 10.5% being only neutral. This was the most unanimously favorable result I observed. It also had the lowest standard deviation, which was 0.68. So this is a recent case, and I just wanted to talk about it because I think it provides another example outside kind of the white Anglo-American view. So this case is
Viola Davis, my Woman King.
The Woman King, one of the only films in this video where I think the lack of historicity had a noticeable and immediate impact on its popular reception. The film follows the old Hollywood formula with great artistic success. Its costumes are gorgeous, many are based on contemporary records, and the cinematography indulges that sense of grand historic scale. The Woman King was widely praised for its glossy, sophisticated style and its groundbreaking subject matter, being the first time a major American production company had adapted the Dahomey Kingdom of 19th century West Africa into film, and its Hollywood-style press and budget brought the subject into the realm of the Western historical epic, and that in itself is a bit problematic, we'll get to it, but the main criticism a lot of people had was how the film downplayed the involvement of the Dahomey Kingdom in the transatlantic slave trade. From my view, the Woman King's Pan-African marketing strategy was undermined, first of all, by the fact that the film's storytellers who initially developed its premise were white. Literally 2 white people who had to sit down and plan, like, this is the historical reality of slavery in Dahomey, and this is how we're going to get around it. And second, there was a very obvious pandering to a primarily Black diaspora audience. I think the strategy was also a little insulting, as if viewers wouldn't know or care enough about African history to fact check and would just be so grateful for the representation and so excited to support the movie. The filmmakers adopt Dahomey's complex and compromising politics by making the Agojie warriors into abolitionists who fight to free slaves of their enemy Oyo Kingdom and end the slave trade with Portugal. The main historical conflict of that time, around the mid-19th century, was actually Dahomey negotiations with the British Empire, which demanded the kingdom stop participating in the slave trade. I should be clear, the British Empire was not a hero either, but it was protecting its own colonial interests. While Dahomey had pivoted to exporting palm oil for a short time, that was Nanisca's arc. She was trying to get the king to sell palm oil. It wasn't profitable compared to the sale of human beings. In fact, the kingdom could not have reached its splendor without slavery. And in real life, some of the Agojie themselves may have been enslaved. I do hope The Woman King offers a precedent to future African historical epics in a global market, but I don't think that a non-African audience needs to be served these works by Hollywood in order to take interest. There's also space to elevate and promote African filmmakers with more first-hand experience and sensitivity. The American industry should not be the gatekeeper of who gets to share these stories. I found this really interesting interview with Leonard Bonchicon, who was one of the historical advisors for the film, speaking with Laura Zornoza for Time. And Zornoza writes, "When European history is discussed, scholars acknowledge the continent's heavy involvement in the slave trade, or at least they are starting to do so more now, and simultaneously recognize the contributions that each nation made to the world. Neither existed without the other." And then Bonchicon says, "There will always be time to consume the legacy of Dahomey and the slave trade. But at the same time, like you do for any other continent, any other country, we also need to talk about the things that they did independent of this. Because the Agojie women of 1823 who were portrayed in the movie were not slave raiders. Responding to the online backlash, Viola Davis said, "Most of the story is fictionalized. It has to be." Her husband and one of the film's producers, Julius Tenon, said, "It's history, but we have to take license. We have to entertain people. If we just told a history lesson, which we very well could have, that would be a documentary. We didn't want to shy away from the truth. The history is massive, and there are truths on that are there. If people want to learn more, they can investigate more."
Now, on to a few more questions that I forgot to film contemporaneously with the other talking head parts of this video before we move on. The first being, historical media is too biased towards modern politics or stereotypes. The mean for this question was 4.16, and the standard deviation was 0.94. So I totally agree with this, and the responses all make sense to me. Using historical topics allegorically, I think, has its limits and goes from topical to tacky, if not offensive, very quickly. I think we always have to be willing to understand things in their own context as much as possible, because honestly, jumping to compare something new to something familiar is understandable, but if you stop there, it just seems like a very juvenile way of seeing things, as well as very self-centered, which is a bit of the problem with the whole Americanization thing when you're not used to having to adapt to another cultural or temporal perspective. And what really is this video if not an exploration of how modern stereotypes and assumptions ruin historical accuracy in media? And that, I think, is very important to keep in mind looking at this graph, where we see how a lot of us are in agreement that current media offerings do not reflect the diversity of the ancient world. So the mean for this one was 4.61, and the standard deviation was only 0.53. So on one hand, I do wish I got into this one a little earlier and we could discuss stuff like whitewashing and historical revision more thoroughly, but on the other hand, that is definitely a topic that can eat up an entire video, and it has such a long history of its own. It is very difficult to navigate and always has been. But for sure, a lot of the peplum films, particularly the ones we are talking about in this video, are very monotonous in terms of the kinds of people on screen and everything from social class to race and gender and orientation. We pick up on assumptions that aren't just about how these people lived or how they dressed and what they talked like, but also who they are, and it sends a message that people who look a certain way or who hold certain identities were kind of a modern invention, which is absolutely not the case. And that's something that luckily we are seeing a lot more popular awareness of, but I think still there is a lot of discourse around this that is not productive and that is just very tone deaf towards the actual history of whitewashing in historical media particularly. We will talk a little bit more about this in part 2, because a lot of you brought this up in your responses, which was really great. And I think it speaks to how much more awareness there is now and how having more familiarity with a time period allows you to embrace those other perspectives that tend to be often like very purposefully erased from mainstream narratives. It's just sad because like the general public deserves to know that too. And especially like think of how many people could feel embraced and welcomed into learning more and researching for themselves if they felt like the media and by extension the history actually had like a place for them. Now back to me from 7 months ago.
I saw this with Ridley Scott and Napoleon too. Davis and her husband made me think of this, where one of the frustrating things seems to be people refusing to take credit or accountability when they do make a mistake in adapting something. It's inevitable that will happen, and even if it's not egregious on the scale of having Napoleon invade Egypt and knock the nose off the Sphinx or whatever happened in that people were so mad about, part of being an artist and being a professional is accepting criticism and living with the fact that not everyone who encounters your work will enjoy it. I think the reason for this is that these people do see how taking too many liberties undermines their credibility, and that's why they react so defensively. I kind of feel like they thought their own style and artistry would make up for it, and of course when it doesn't, that makes them feel like they failed in part of their mission of telling the story. It can be frustrating when people focus so much on the history that they maybe ignore the artistry that these people felt like they put into their projects. But in the end, maybe the artistry just wasn't there. So now I want to turn to a few case studies that I think are important to look at in order to address what I saw as a kind of concerning binary in a lot of my research, which is the false dichotomy between education and entertainment. And I want to start by talking about a series that has been bothering me for 2 years. Now, I am talking about the Netflix series, The Roman Empire. Many of you have probably heard of this show. It calls itself, or Netflix calls it, a docudrama of 3 famous Romans: Commodus in season 1, Julius Caesar in season 2, and Caligula in season 3. The show is an insult to its viewers' intelligence, but ignoring the fact that it's ugly and boring to watch, the Roman Empire is incredibly selective about what aspects of each story to adapt, and represents everything through the typical mud filter and the dumbed-down language of a viral YA novel that does absolutely nothing for its credibility. The Roman Empire clings so closely to this essence of history, which in practice means they leave out important context and events in order to provide a completely bland, pandering version of whatever real story they're trying to tell. They play up scenes of military action and seduction and leave out a lot of the political movement, as well as the important moments of levity. We have a lot of funny stories from all of those 3 guys. Many of them are very famous, like you don't see Caligula declaring war on Neptune or making his horse into a senator, because I think that would show how this series edits everything to be like a very limited idea of what an epic should be. As for the creative choices, one of the things that was so annoying to me, it's like it would have been easy to get around, I guess. I'm not like a casting agent, but it was also such a fundamental issue, is that every actor is so boring. They have no interesting facial features, their voices aren't memorable, they have no chemistry with each other, and I think the script was terrible. I don't think they were given anything to work with, so a lot of it was the show's fault. But they also bear no resemblance to the actual historical figures they're supposed to represent. And this can also make it very difficult to follow and identify what's going on. The only exception is Cassius Dio in season 1. I actually did really like this actor. But as for the costumes, they might as well be from Game of Thrones or some other generic fantasy epic. There's no element of historicity, with most of the men looking like somebody's D&D character, and most of the women very clearly styled to appeal to the modern male gaze. Speaking of, I did pick up on a lot of modern gender norms through the selective storytelling, especially downplaying the role of women in Roman politics by repeatedly reducing important historical figures to side characters who could only wield power through seduction. Obviously, the erasure of female relationships is nothing new to the epic genre, but in this case, it's also insulting because it's not even as if these scenes or these characters add any sex appeal to the series. The show has some of the worst sex scenes ever, but also this erasure does tie into the kind of linear view I was talking about earlier, where having women be more participatory in the historical A-plot would challenge the idea that women in all eras before our own were a mute and powerless class of domestic slaves who survived by men's favor and nothing else. So 1000% my least favorite part of the show is the writing. I kind of feel like there's been a bit of a downgrade in TV and film writing. I think a lot of the earlier epics, like the first wave peplum genre, it had a lot of it was very flowery, but I think because they were trying to evoke that sense of historical scale, as well as the fact that a lot of those were based on books, it had this kind of literary quality that was really beautiful to listen to. And I feel like that's kind of been lost. The Roman Empire in particular, everyone says exactly what they're doing or what they're thinking of doing. There's no suspense plot-wise, and there's no sense of the rhetoric and complex interpersonal dynamics that shaped Roman politics accuracy-wise. By far the most tragic victim of this disaster is Marcus Aurelius. the famously bearded philosopher emperor who looked like this in the series and who talks like this.
When I die, you're going to be sole emperor of Rome. Even when you've taken the throne, they'll come for you. All of them. You can't trust any of them.
But it's really remarkable because there's so much source material there. The eras that they chose are so eventful and impactful, yet every creative and narrative choice is so predictable that all the political and military action feels unremarkable. All the characters feel boring, and it's literally like Caligula and Germanicus. But the show is especially insulting to all the historians who contributed their time and knowledge to the series, only for their talking head segments be intercut with 5 minutes of bad CGI, shallow dialogue, or random orgy. What video game from 2009 is this from? Where'd they get this asset? This is the version of antiquity that some people go around with, holding it in their heads when they encounter future representations of the era. The show builds itself as a docudrama, as in like documentary, that puts on these historians like a disguise. The Roman Empire presents itself as factual, but it goes to such great lengths to avoid the specific facts that might genuinely teach an audience something they didn't learn in Spartacus' Gods of the Arena. So the Roman Empire is not entertaining to me because it's so badly cast, directed, written, and acted that it follows a formula that has worked at this point for decades of historical media. So this brings me back to this original binary of education and entertainment. And one of the kind of concerns that's brought up for me is, but will people engage with educational media if it's not also entertaining? That is the appeal of somebody like Mary Beard, a specialist author who writes for a non-specialist audience, in a way that's accessible, educational, and fun for them as readers. Like, why do we assume that didactic media should be delivered from a lectern with a black and white slide deck?
Even when I brought up this issue with you, the answer was a very resounding no, that a film or books or series that claim to be historically accurate do not just end up being more boring than those that don't. The mean response for this was 1.8, so a very strong disagree, and the standard deviation was about 0.77, and only 1.8% of you agreed at all.
But another important thing, I think, is that an audience can know something isn't educational, they can know something isn't accurate, but they can still be influenced by it. Fictional or fictionalized portrayals can soften viewers to certain perspectives and characters, causing them to view people like Commodus and Nero unfavorably, giving them a more favorable impression of Leonidas and the Spartans, who were actually not really that great as warriors, and who did ultimately lose the battle. And I even read that the representation of Petronius in the novel Quo Vadis revived an interest in Petronian scholarship in the Western classical tradition. We don't only learn by sitting in front of a documentary on the screen and being lectured. We learn through set and costume design, the way people talk and conduct themselves, what the extras are doing, everything we see of the world around them. It bothers me that people so expect history to be boring, and that we need it to be changed for us to take any interest in it. That's why I hear so many people saying they love stuff like Catullus, for example, because he's so unexpected compared to the pop culture version of antiquity. You can't imagine Ovid writing the Ars Amatoria in a city that looks like this. When we read real classical literature, all we find is emotion, detail, color, intimacy, and humanity. Except in Apuleius. I'm just joking. I'm actually an Ovid anti. One of the statements I presented was, popular discourse about a time period is overly informed by media portrayals. And this was also very consistently affirmative. 87.9% of you agreed, with the mean response being about 4.4, and the standard deviation being only 0.75. So yeah, I was talking about this a little earlier, but the fact that a lot of people approach history as a constant progression is definitely reflected in media, which is I think a big part of the reason why historical film is so often dull and lifeless, is because filmmakers view the past as full of oppressed, miserable, sick people who live in an ideologically and literally diseased world. And I think this benefits a non-specialist audience who can feel good about their own relative open-mindedness and comfort in which they live. This isn't exclusive to second wave peplum. I think movies like Spartacus do this a bit as well through more explicit narration or through the story itself rather than through the imagery and the aesthetics.
In the last century, before the birth of the new faith called Christianity, which was destined to overthrow the pagan tyranny of Rome and bring about a new society, the Roman Republic stood at the very center of the civilized world. Yet even at the zenith of her pride and power, the Republic lay fatally stricken with a disease called human slavery.
I think this also makes the world of that given film or series, whatever, feel more within the viewer's reach. They can understand it because it's been so reduced and simplified. It becomes predictable, and they can also kind of feel superior to it, which I think therefore leads to a false sense of understanding of the time period. That's just my thought. But when I asked you guys, again, 91.4% of you agreed that most people don't know as much about history as they think they do. The mean response was 4.34, and the standard deviation was 0.69. But there's a bit of a different result for this statement. I can usually tell when something is accurate and when it's not. So a lot of you were very self-aware. The mean response was 3.14. And the standard deviation was 0.93, but luckily a lot of you also said that you do your own research to complement your viewing, with a mean response of 3.9 and a standard deviation of 1, so a little less consistent than some of the other questions we've seen, but nevertheless slightly affirmative. I'd like to close out this section by talking about a few positive examples. The first being I, Claudius, a BBC series from 1976 based on Robert Graves' novel of the same name.
So at first the section was mostly based on critical reviews, but I thought since I had the time, I would go ahead and watch a few episodes of the show myself, as well as skimming the novel, and add a few personal reflections. And so the place where everybody seems to start when we talk about historical accuracy, the costumes are not one-to-one historical replicas, which is fine, not as in like I'm fine with it, but just not really exceptionally good or bad in any way. I think they maybe are a little more creative than you might see in a lot of other historical media that goes its own way in terms of accuracy, but neither are they super stunning, super couture or anything. It may also be the copy that I watched. This is basically it on the screen, so the colors aren't great. The other kind of disappointing thing that I notice is the cast really does not look anything like the figures they're portraying, least of all Claudius, which is a little disappointing because he has such a distinctive look. And, you know, there's like this whole area of research you can go into where like he might have been disabled in his life and that affected his appearance and how people viewed his image and things like that. But anyway, it is pretty stylized. It is definitely way overacted, which may or may not be your thing. But as for the plot and the story, I think both Robert Graves and the creators of the show did a good job reconstructing Claudius's character and perspective in his memoir, and then preserving that when you transfer it onto the screen. But I identified some symptoms of something I'm calling Memoirs of Hadrian syndrome. Memoirs of Hadrian, if you're not familiar, by Marguerite Yourcenar, is basically the platinum standard for historical writing. It's getting its own TV adaptation soon, but the level of detail and complexity with which she explains away every controversy and every inconsistency in the historical record at some points comes to kind of undermine the sense of authenticity. And as I mentioned previously, we have to keep in mind that our modern surviving sources are often not contemporary with the events and figures they describe. So if anything, I, Claudius, is a worse offender because, unlike Hadrian, Claudius has come into modernity as this dunce-like figure whose life Graves has taken up as a pop culture PR campaign and has to go to much greater lengths to kind of justify why his perspective is worthy of recording. However, the show takes all of this in great humor and in a stylishly tragicomic tone and cinematic visuals that remind me of the later suspense-heavy prestige TV of the 90s, 2000s, and today. I almost wonder if there is some connection to be drawn between Claudius's toxic relationship with his manipulative grandmother Livia and all the family dynamics there, and that between Tony Soprano and his mother, who is also called Livia.
This is a show where the coexistence of historical accuracy with a compelling story really worked in its favor. And I think this is a great example of a show that, rather than putting historical accuracy and entertainment in conflict with one another, it harmonizes them into a really great work of storytelling. So Robert Graves was a working classicist, and he very heavily researched his project. So I think the historicity was really baked into the character of I, Claudius. And if they had gone in a less accurate direction, that wouldn't have really worked well with people who had enjoyed the novel. It wouldn't have captured the same spirit that the novel has. So that was one thing that worked in its favor. The series was shot on a pretty low budget, but production nevertheless balanced the ensemble cast and overlapping storylines to do justice to the novel and to Claudius's life. The sets and costumes are clearly researched, and also very importantly, the writing feels humane and intimate, often very humorous, which is an angle a lot of historical media is very conscious to avoid, despite its scope and historical focus. The LA Times film critic Mary McNamara said, "The blood and breasts may seem pure HBO, but if Claudius could sing, he'd have fit nicely into the cast of Glee." And I don't think that the characters would have so much life and humor if they weren't based so strongly in their real-life counterparts. From what I can tell, the show is night and day from the Roman Empire, which fails to draw a single character out of some of the most famous tyrants, generals, politicians, and perverts in history. I, Claudius is not a show that was made for education, but nevertheless, I think Graves' love for Claudius made it that masterpiece of historical fiction that it is. He saw people treating this figure unfairly because of biased media portrayals, and he wanted to use his own talents and platform to challenge that. Another positive example would be HBO's Rome miniseries, which is a bit more dramatized, but was nevertheless well received for its balancing of historical detail with an engaging visual and narrative style. Jonathan Stamp, the series consultant, said their approach was based on historical authenticity rather than accuracy, which means that while most of the setting and the A-plots were true to life, many smaller events and characters were dramatized. And that is part of the appeal of the show as well. You get to see these historical events unfolding from the perspective of kind of the people on the ground. I think anyone with a genuine interest in the time period would also allow themselves the flexibility to make creative and narrative changes or even sacrifices in order to do it justice.
I think here's a good place to address this question on the survey that I forgot to film, but I was having trouble placing it within this video because it was so divisive, and the majority of respondents either agreed or disagreed, with a very slight majority disagreeing, which I would say I am among those people. I think it's not all that uncommon for there to be a compelling reason to change the history that one is working with, but I also definitely see both sides. The average response was 2.88, but the standard deviation was 1.17, so we were conflicted, and I can definitely see why. We've looked at a lot of examples where a storyteller has kind of gone their own way for whatever reason. Sometimes convenience, sometimes they genuinely feel like staying true to a certain historical narrative doesn't fit the particular story that they are trying to tell. And I feel like I have been very heavily on the side of historical accuracy, so I want to make clear that there are many cases where that can result in a really amazing version of something, but I think the word rarely is also doing a lot of work here, where sure there may be cases like that, but it's not every movie that you can say this was the right decision for that director or that writer to make. So those are more or less kind of what I got from this question. I hope all of that makes sense. This is definitely one of the ones where it's a little harder to, just fall clearly on one side or the other. So now we will get back to the case studies.
So another example I would like to talk about, not just because I love it so much, but also because I find it so fascinating, is the movie Fellini's Satyricon. If you still haven't seen this film, please go do it. It's online and it's only 2 hours. But this was actually one of the things that sparked my interest in covering this topic more deeply, because while I was researching just in my usual way, I came across a quote from the costume designer Danilo Donati, and the costume design of Fellini's Satyricon is, I would say, as well known as any aspect of the film. It was pretty influential in fashion.
Dolce & Gabbana even contributed to the Criterion restoration.
But Donati said, "The truth is a friend of lovers of historical accuracy, which, as one knows, is the death of creativity." And so I wanted to talk more about this because I think Fellini's Satyricon is a really good example of a project that actually does prioritize creativity over historical fidelity, but the result is so different from a lot of the films we've discussed before, like Gladiator, where even though the director says that they're just trying to express themselves and tell a story, it ends up being more boring. Sorry. I think this is a case where that creative vision actually does make the film more interesting and enhances its artistic merit. And here we're getting into a little more of the text versus history thing, because of course Fellini's Satyricon is based on the novel The Satyricon, so there are historical details that one could draw from the novel, but the film is based in a very broad conception of ancient Rome. The English tagline, which I hate, is "Before Christ, after Fellini," so we can kind of assume it's based in the earlier empire. And so I wanted to start with another quote by the director. Speaking with Dario Zanelli, Fellini said, "I don't want to make a film that is archaeological or historical or nostalgic. Our vision of the Roman world has been distorted by textbooks. We are the victims of aesthetic judgments. We love ruins, but their fascination belongs precisely to a civilization of ruins, which is another thing altogether. On the other hand, I don't want to do Petronius either. How can you satirize a world you don't know? Satire makes sense only if it's applied to the world you're in contact with. Could you do a satire on Martians?" And I really like that quote. I think logically, of course, it makes a lot of sense, and it also explains so much of his process, because even though he was working with so much historical source material, the film ended up being totally different, yet harmonizes with the book so well. So again, without overdrawing the difference between text and history, Fellini set his film for the most part in Rome under a tyrannical teenage emperor, and presumably in the 1st century BCE, rather than in Magna Graecia under Nero, as we assume based on what survives of the book. And while these languages are therefore not textually faithful and also do not correlate with any historical knowledge we have of Rome in that era, they accomplished their own contextual ends. The change in setting was more authentic to Fellini, who worked a lot with the city of Rome, and the change in time also fit very nicely with the disorienting and futuristic atmosphere where the viewer isn't sure what is taking place when. But another great thing about Fellini's Satyricon is the way that it confuses the signifiers that an audience would associate with Roman times. The characters wear elaborate costumes and jewelry with antique silhouettes, but glazed with a faded patina and accessorized with strange mechanical-looking shapes that make them look like cyborgs or aliens more than humans. We see a similar approach through the use of Latin, another common signifier, which in the film appears as a very harsh-sounding dialect, alongside many other languages, some that were just spoken by the extras and different members of the cast, and some that were entirely made up just for a few moments in the film. There are orgies, but they take place between people who are painted bright colors, bald, fat, and either unappetizingly old or disturbingly young. The city of Rome, as it appears, is a crumbling labyrinth of ruins, which already looks half buried, as if in the ashes of Vesuvius. Finally, and this is probably most apparent in the art gallery scene, which is my favorite, we can see all the different artistic influences that are at play in the film. Some works appearing from the Bronze Age and Minoan civilizations, and some appearing that look as late as perhaps the Byzantine Empire. I think it's also a little ironic that in subverting so many conventional images of ancient Rome, Fellini's Satyricon actually approaches historical accuracy in some ways more closely than other films that sincerely aspired to it. The depictions of homoerotic and homosocial culture, the African and Asian influences, and the ugly life of the lower classes that is rarely shown in other historical epics. I guess that's one of the benefits of disregarding believability, not necessarily in favor of accuracy, but just by intentionally disturbing the audience's comfort, it seems like it grants permission to explore a lot of these things. And I also think that's part of what made the film age so well. Before we move on, I also wanted to bring up the fragmentation aspect. Fellini adopts this fragmented state in which the Satyricon survives in his film, even though it would be completely possible, as Gianluigi Polidoro did in his version, to attempt to reconstruct a linear plot. I really appreciated this, even though I love Polidoro's version. I think the forgery by Noto, which had attempted to very neatly rearrange the fragments into a very poorly paced form, is not as successful. But for me, like in my heart, the whole idea of trying to fit these different sections into each other again and again makes me sad, because we know that no matter what combination you come up with, it's never going to be the book that Petronius wrote. That took much longer than I thought. I don't have an outro scripted because I hadn't been planning to divide things up like this, but I am going to end the video here and talk about each of the short response answers that I received in the next video. I already have most of that edited, so it should be out pretty soon. And again, I really appreciate all the engagement with the survey and that so many of you took the time out of your day to provide me with so many thoughtful answers, and you've given me so much to talk about and definitely shifted my perspective quite a lot from what I went into this video with. I definitely feel like there are a lot of issues with the way that the public engages with history through media, and historical accuracy ultimately does play a large role in public perception, even though artistic license is often taken and audiences kind of understand that on a superficial level. Nevertheless, these representations do really shape our understanding in a way that can be harmful. So will this change how I personally interpret historical subjects in my work? Not necessarily for now, but I'm not a professional yet, so that doesn't really mean anything. But I really appreciate, again, all the survey answers. I appreciate you for watching this video until the end. If you do have any thoughts you want to share before I edit and upload the next section, I can't guarantee that I will get to it. I don't check YouTube notifications all that much, but if you do have any quick thoughts, although the survey is closed, please share them in the comments. I would really love to hear what any of you had to say, and I do have a post about this on my community tab, so you can also respond there. And also share, what's the best historical media you've ever seen or ever read? What's the worst? What's so bad about it? I would love to hear any of that and any thoughts you might have. Oh, are you excited for the Odyssey movie with Christopher Nolan? Unfortunately, it was too late to really address it in this video, but let me know. And thank you so much again. I'll see you soon. Bye.